My husband had a second family in another city, another woman, other children, another house bought with our money, and he had been living a perfect double life for 7 years. But he didn't know I was a forensic financial investigator and could trace every single dollar he had spent on that parallel life. There's a moment when the world stops making sense. Not in a poetic way, not as a metaphor, but in a literal and physical way. Like when you lose your balance in a place where you believe you were completely steady and the ground you knew by heart suddenly behaves as if it were made of something else entirely. That moment came for me on a Friday night, sitting in front of my work computer, staring at a bank statement that could not be explained by any version of reality I believed I knew. It took me 40 minutes to understand what I was looking at. And when I understood it, something inside me reorganized itself in a way that has no name, but that I recognized as permanent. Nothing was going to be the same again. And the strangest thing, what still surprises me when I think about it, is that in that moment I did not cry. I opened a new folder on my computer, named it Case, and started working. My name is Daniela. I am 38 years old. I am a forensic financial investigator, which is the formal way of saying I am paid to find money that people try to hide. I work with law firms, with companies and litigation processes, with financial institutions that need to trace irregular money flows. I spend my days looking at bank statements, banking transactions, wire transfers, spending patterns, and finding in those numbers the story that someone did not want told. It is a job that teaches you something fundamental about money. Money does not lie. People lie. Documents can be forged. Alibis can be constructed. But money moves, and every movement leaves a trace. And that trace is objective in a way that words cannot be. That truth, which I had applied professionally for 11 years, was what revealed to me the life my husband had been living in parallel to ours for 7 years. I was married to Marcos for 9 years. Marcos is an architect. He is 42 years old, intelligent, organized, with a capacity for planning and structuring things that I always admired because it complemented my way of thinking. He traveled frequently for work, something that from the beginning was part of the dynamic of our relationship, and that never generated distrust in me, because I also traveled, because we both had demanding careers, because trust was the foundation on which we had built what we had. Or so I believed. We had no children. We had talked about it several times, had been close on a couple of occasions, but the moment had never arrived in a way that felt completely right to both of us. I now understand that there may have been reasons for that which I did not know about. We lived well. Not extravagantly, but well. We had a house we had bought together, savings plans, a life that from the outside, and also from the inside as far as I could see, appeared solid and real. The first number that didn't add up appeared in a routine review I do every quarter of our shared finances. It is a professional habit I transferred to my personal life years ago. I review the account statements of our joint accounts, verify that the transactions correspond with what I would expect to see given our activities and usual expenses, and identify anything that falls outside the established pattern. What I found that Friday was a transfer of a moderate amount to an account I did not recognize. It was not an alarming amount in itself. It was the kind of transaction most people would overlook, that they would attribute to some forgotten expense or minor payment. But I do not overlook transactions I don't recognize. It is my job not to. I searched for the destination account. It was a current account in the name of a woman called Valentina Reyes. I did not know that name. I searched the complete history of transfers to that account. It was not the first. It was the most recent in a series that extended, when I went back far enough in the transaction history, to approximately 7 years earlier. 7 years of regular transfers, of variable but consistent amounts, to an account I had never seen and whose holder I had never heard mentioned. That night, I said nothing to Marcos. Marcos was in another city that week on a project that had been going on for several months. We had spoken by phone that afternoon like any other day, a 20-minute conversation about ordinary things, and I had responded with the normalness of someone who does not yet know what she knows. I sat down in front of my computer when I hung up and started doing what I know how to do. I started building the financial map. With legal access to our joint accounts and with the tools I use professionally to trace money flows, I began reconstructing where every dollar that could not be explained by the expenses I knew about had gone. What emerged over the following hours was an image that became sharper and more terrible as the data organized itself. The transfers to Valentina Reyes's account were not the only ones. There were other accounts. There were utility payments in a city that was not ours. There was a mortgage traceable through public records in the name of Marcos and Valentina Reyes jointly on a property in that city. A property purchased jointly with his name and the name of another woman, financed in part with money from our joint accounts over 7 years. I worked through that entire night without sleeping, not because I needed the whole night to understand what was happening. I understood that with sufficient clarity in the first 2 hours. I worked through the night because I needed to have the complete picture before making any move. Because in my work, the difference between acting with partial information and acting with complete information is the difference between making costly mistakes and making correct decisions. At 6 in the morning, I had the following picture. Marcos had been maintaining a second life in another city for 7 years. Valentina Reyes was his partner in that life. They had a house. They had 2 children, discovered through public birth records where Marcos appeared as the father. The children were 6 and 4 years old, respectively. The total spending I could trace directly to that parallel life over 7 years was an amount that represented approximately 35% of what we had earned together during that period. 35% of our shared life had been financing another life I did not know existed. I poured myself a cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and I allowed myself exactly 15 minutes to let all of that land emotionally before moving on to the next step. I called my attorney at 9 in the morning. Attorney Fernanda Ortiz had been my personal attorney for 12 years and had seen difficult situations with me before, though none of this magnitude. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she told me I had an exceptionally well-documented case for several simultaneous actions. Divorce on grounds, with the financial documentation as evidence of the double life. Reclamation of marital assets that had been diverted to the parallel life without my knowledge or consent, which in legal terms was a fraudulent disposition of marital property. And, depending on how the investigation developed, possibly a criminal complaint for marital fraud. She told me the position I was in was exceptionally strong precisely because of the nature of my work. The documentation I had built in one night was the kind that normally takes months to build with hired investigators. It was clean, traceable, verifiable. She asked me when I wanted to proceed. I told her I wanted to give Marcos the opportunity to have a conversation before the papers arrived. Not out of generosity toward him, but because I wanted to look him in the eyes when he knew that I knew everything. Marcos came back on Sunday. He arrived with his suitcase, with the normal tiredness of someone who had just traveled, with that domestic familiarity of someone returning home and assuming everything is as he left it. I asked him to sit down. I told him I had reviewed the accounts. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. It was a small change, almost imperceptible, that I would not have noticed if I had not been watching specifically for it. He asked me which accounts I was talking about. I opened my laptop and showed him the complete financial map, organized chronologically, with amounts, dates, destination accounts, properties, birth records. Everything. Marcos said nothing for a period of time that felt very long. Then he said he could explain. I told him I had no doubt about that people can always explain things. That the question was not whether he could explain it, but whether the explanation could change what the numbers demonstrated with absolute clarity. He did not respond to that. What followed was a legal process that lasted 11 months, and that was, in technical terms, one of the cleanest cases my attorney said she had handled in her career, precisely because the documentation was irrefutable. The fraudulent disposition of marital assets was the center of the civil case. I was able to demonstrate, dollar by dollar, with bank statements and wire transfer records and property documents, exactly how much of the marital estate had been diverted toward Marcos's parallel life over 7 years. The judge who reviewed the evidence ordered that those assets, including the proportional value of the property Marcos had purchased jointly with Valentina, be considered in the marital division as debt in my favor. The house we shared was sold. With my portion of that sale, plus the compensation ordered by the judge for the fraudulent disposition, I received an amount that allowed me to buy my own apartment without a mortgage and maintain a significant financial reserve. It was not everything that 7 years of shared life represented in emotional terms, but it was everything the law could give me, and it was given with precision thanks to the documentation. There is something people ask me when I tell this story, when I tell it to someone I trust, and that is how I handled it emotionally. The honest answer is that I handled it badly for some months and well for other months, and that there's still days when some small detail activates something I thought I had processed and reminds me that emotional processing has no finish line. What I can say is that taking immediate action, converting the pain into work and the work into documentation and the documentation into a solid legal case, was the way I specifically was able to function during that period. It is not the universally correct way. It is the way that worked for me, given the person I am and the tools I had available. I can also say that the strangest moment of the entire process was not any of the ones I would have expected. It was not the night of the discovery. It was not the conversation with Marcos. It was not any legal hearing. It was the day I received the keys to my new apartment. I was alone. I walked in, moved through the empty rooms, stood in front of the window that looks out onto a park that I loved from the first time I saw the apartment. And I thought that everything in that apartment, from the key in my hand to the possibilities of what would come next, was completely mine. Not shared, not negotiated, not built on a story that had turned out to be partially false. Mine. That thought, in that moment, was the closest thing to peace I had felt in many months. With Marcos, I have no contact beyond what the legal process required to close. I have no active feelings of hatred, even though there was hatred. I have something more like the distance one has with a person who was part of your history, but is no longer part of your life. What I do have is this: 11 years of career that taught me that money does not lie, and the confirmation that that professional truth also applies in personal life, even though I wish I had never needed to prove it this way. If there is something I want you to take from this story, it is that shared finances deserve attention. Not automatic distrust, not paranoid surveillance, but informed attention. Bank statements are documents that tell stories. Learning to read them does not require being a forensic investigator. It requires the habit of looking. And if one day you find in those numbers something that cannot be explained by the life you believe you know, trust what the numbers are telling you. Numbers do not lie. People do. If this story left you breathless, comment. Do you review your shared finances regularly? Like if you believe financial independence is the best protection. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who needs to know that numbers always tell the truth. Practical tip: if you have joint bank accounts with your partner, review them regularly. Not as a sign of distrust, but as a financial health habit. Know the usual transactions so that any irregularity is visible. Your financial peace of mind is part of your personal security.